If you were an average cowboy, you probably couldn't even hear the challenge to draw. The guy yelling draw was usually somewhere safer, far from the actual gun smoke. Smart move on his part. Wild West barflies had the highest life expectancy in the West, right behind the saloon owners who instigated the fights. In the first 15 seconds of a shootout, nearly half the participants would trip on their own feet or their comrades'. Wild West main streets weren't neat, cleared areas. They were dusty, uneven paths with hidden ruts waiting to send you face first into the dirt. Nothing says fearsome gunslinger quite like falling on your face while screaming, "Oh, my spur." You didn't charge like heroes in dime novels. You shuffled forward in a nervous crouch, your knees weak from standing in the oppressive sun for hours. The man next to you breathed heavily, stinking of cheap whiskey and fear. Frontier breath mints weren't a thing, which might explain why men yelled so much. It was the only way to breathe without smelling your battle buddy's last meal. Everyone shouted, but nobody could tell you exactly what they were yelling. Most men just screamed to push down their terror. Studies show that in combat, about 70% of men make involuntary noises they don't even remember afterward. If you could translate most Wild West battle cries, they'd probably come out to something like, "Ma, help, I regret selling the farm." Then came the first shot. Someone's bullet splintered the wooden post next to you. Your ears rang, but you couldn't tell if it was from the shot or from the man who just screamed in your face. The noise was deafening, not heroic battle music, but a wall of grunts, screams, and gunpowder blasts striking wood or flesh. Your hand vibrated so hard from gripping your revolver, your grandchildren would be born with the shakes. 2 minutes in, your grand shootout plan was reduced to one simple goal: stay upright. Falling meant death from the weight of other men stumbling over you. The ground became slick with blood and spit. Your arms ached from holding up your weapon. The sun beat down, cooking you inside your woolen jacket. Cowboy attire, the world's least comfortable portable sauna. The only weight loss program where you might lose 15 pounds of sweat or your scalp, whichever comes first. Your world shrank to the few feet around you. You just saw the terrified eyes of the man opposite you, who was just as confused as you were. In that moment, you both silently agreed that whoever told you the shootout was glorious deserved a special place in hell, and all this was just the beginning. If you survived the initial clash, you'd face the next brutal reality of a shootout. Real Wild West gunfights looked more like a chaotic bar brawl than a gentleman's duel. Fighters didn't square off one-on-one. They ganged up whenever possible. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not poor sportsmanship. Outlaws didn't follow a code of honor in a shootout. They followed the "I want to go home alive" code, which trumped everything else. The crush of bodies made proper aiming nearly impossible. You had about 6 inches of space to move your arm. You couldn't do those big dramatic flourishes when pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow combatants. Most gunfights involved awkwardly firing your pistol forward like you were trying to hit someone on a crowded stagecoach. Pistols were rarely the killing blow anyway. According to forensic analysis of historical shootouts, most fatal wounds came from downward strikes to the top of the skull or neck. Exactly what would happen when someone fell and others piled on. Wild West shootout strategy was less defeat your opponent fairly, and more shoot him when he's down, then shoot him again, then maybe once more for luck. The butt of your rifle, the heavy wooden end, often proved more useful than a precise shot. Gun experts call this pistol whipping or butt stroking, where you'd hold the barrel and swing the stock like a club. This technique was called the skull cracker, which is probably the most honest name for any fighting move in history. Wide-brimmed hats saved lives but created new problems. They limited vision to a narrow slit and turned your head into a sweat oven under the sun. After just 20 minutes of fighting, the temperature inside a cowboy hat could reach over 100. Many fighters died not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. Wild West gunslingers basically fought inside portable saunas while people tried to kill them, making them either the bravest or most foolish humans in history. If you fell during this chaos, you had about 2 seconds to get up, not because of some rule, but because that's how long it took for boots to start trampling you or bullets to find gaps in your clothing. Examination of Wild West shootout sites shows that many bodies were found face down, in just inches of dust. Not dramatic deaths, just slow suffocation after falling. Wounds often came from unexpected angles. Your vest might stop a bullet from the front, but what about the guy shooting you from behind or the side? A typical fighter received attacks from at least 3 different directions within any 1-minute period. Your head would spin trying to track all the threats, which is ironic since keeping your head from literally spinning off was the main goal. The crushing, trampling, and disorientation took more lives than straight-up combat skills. If by some miracle you survive this chaotic dog pile with all your limbs still attached, your next challenge would be dealing with whatever weapons came flying at you. The weapons of Wild West shootouts weren't the gleaming masterpieces you see in museum displays. Most were rough tools designed for one purpose: tearing through whatever stood between you and your enemy's soft parts. Let's talk about shotguns first. Shotguns weren't fancy. They were basically the same tool used for hunting fowl, just modified to rip through doors, wooden walls, and unfortunately, human bodies. They had a major advantage. You didn't need much training to use one effectively. Point, pull the trigger, and physics did the rest. The downside: once your shotgun discharged, reloading in a close quarters fight was a death sentence. Wild West battlefield findings show that many shotgun wielders died while trying to reload their weapon. A shotgun running out of shells in a gunfight was the Wild West equivalent of your phone, dying at 99% battery, frustrating and potentially deadly. Rifles were the most common weapon in Wild West shootouts, with some factions using them for up to 70% of their forces. Why? They were cheap to make and required minimal training. A simple wooden stock with a metal barrel could be mass-produced easily, even by smaller towns with limited resources. The real benefit was range. You could shoot someone from 50 yards away while they were still trying to get close enough to hit you with a pistol. The drawback was maneuverability. In tight formations, rifles became more a hazard than help. Battlefield records mention numerous accidental rifle injuries to allies. Many Wild West fighters got shot more often by their friends' rifles than by their enemies' pistols. A painful lesson in watching your back in the most literal sense. Knives solved a problem that revolvers couldn't: close quarters combat after your gun was empty. As firearms improved, hand-to-hand became less common, but a good Bowie knife was always handy. The solution: stop shooting and start stabbing. A knife was essentially a sharpened piece of steel, designed to slice flesh and gut enemies without needing to reload. Simple, effective, and terrifying. Church records from the period show that many religious figures avoided carrying guns, favoring knives, because they technically didn't shed blood in the same way, and thus didn't violate religious restrictions. Wild West logic at its finest: I can't shoot you, but I can turn your insides into ribbons. God's totally fine with that. Revolvers get all the glory in stories, but they were actually the least common weapon in Wild West shootouts. Why? They were expensive. Really expensive. A good revolver could cost as much as a small horse. They required special steel, skilled gunsmiths, and years of training to use effectively. Only lawmen and professional gunslingers typically carried them, and contrary to movie magic, revolvers jammed frequently. Analysis of battlefield pistols shows that many had been repaired multiple times before their final use. Nothing ruins your heroic moment quite like your fancy pistol misfiring on the first shot, leaving you holding what amounts to a very expensive metal paperweight. Then there were the improvised weapons, the desperate solutions of homesteaders and last resort fighters. Farm tools repurposed for war were remarkably common. Pickaxes, shovels, and even sharpened wagon spokes appeared regularly on Wild West battlefields. Records from several major shootouts indicate up to 20% of common folk fought with modified farming equipment. These makeshift weapons often proved surprisingly effective, mainly because no one expected to be defeated by a gardening tool. Death by shovel wasn't glorious, but it was just as final as death by bullet, and considerably more embarrassing to explain in the afterlife. The craftsmanship of weapons varied wildly, too. While marshals and notorious outlaws wielded masterfully crafted pieces, most ordinary folks used mass-produced arms of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, and improperly tempered metal were common problems. Many weapons failed during use, leaving their owners scrambling for alternatives. As these crude weapons found their targets, Wild West fighters quickly learned that their clothing didn't make them invincible, just slower when trying to escape. And the wounds these brutal tools left behind, they opened the door to a whole new level of battlefield horror. All those weapons we just talked about, they weren't designed to look cool. They were designed to tear through human bodies, and tear they did. Thick clothing helped, but not as much as you'd think. A denim jacket could stop a glancing blow, once, maybe twice, but a direct hit from a rifle or shotgun, that fabric would fold right into your flesh, turning your protection into part of the wound. Records from frontier doctors indicate that about 40% of armed civilian casualties had shattered bones despite their clothing being intact. Clothing was basically Wild West bubble wrap. It could handle the first impact, but anything after that was just making crunchy noises as you broke. A hit to the shoulder might take the whole arm with it. Wild West weapons didn't make clean cuts. They tore, shredded, and mangled. Most fighters who lost limbs in battle didn't die from the injury itself, but from blood loss or the infection that followed. Blood loss happened far faster than in movies where heroes fight on despite multiple wounds. The human body contains roughly 10 pints of blood, and losing just 2 can cause unconsciousness. Records suggest that many fighters bled out in under 5 minutes after major wounds. Sometimes you didn't even know you were hit until your vision blurred and your knees gave out. Internal injuries from blunt weapons were actually worse than cuts. Nothing to stitch up, just pain and panic. A solid punch or rifle, a hit might not break the skin, but could rupture organs, crack ribs, or cause brain bleeding. Wild West doctors had a technical term for these hidden injuries, the "oh no, he was fine a minute ago" syndrome. Not every wound was dramatic. Teeth flew out when jaws took hits. Eyes got gouged by splinters from wooden fences. Small wounds that today would need just a few stitches became life-threatening. Due to infection, records from frontier hospitals show that for every person who died in a shootout, 3 more died afterward from wound infections. There were no medics waiting on the sidelines. The closest thing to battlefield medicine was other fighters tying bandanas around wounded limbs to slow bleeding or cauterizing wounds with heated knife tips. Wild West pain scales ranged from "I can still fight" to "please just kill me now," with very little in between. Field hospitals, when they existed at all, were usually just sheds where the wounded were laid out on hay. Surgical tools weren't sterilized. They were maybe wiped on a cloth if you were lucky. Wild West surgery success rates hovered around 30%, and most procedures involved amputation. Not because it was always necessary, but because it was quick. The mental trauma from these wounds often proved as devastating as the physical damage. Many survivors described feeling their minds fragment during a shootout, especially after seeing or experiencing horrific injuries. And as the shootout wore on, your mind would begin to play tricks on you. The Wild West shootout wasn't just a test of physical strength. It was a mental nightmare that few were prepared for. As the shootout raged on, something strange happened to fighters' minds. Something that training couldn't prevent, and that bravery couldn't overcome. Where am I? This question haunted many fighters after just 10 minutes of combat. The constant movement, the spinning to face threats from all sides, and the lack of clear sight lines meant that many gunslingers quickly lost their sense of direction. Without modern communication systems, groups became separated and disorganized. Studies of battle accounts reveal that approximately 60% of Wild West combatants couldn't identify which direction they were facing after the initial clash. This explains why some shootouts ended with both sides accidentally retreating from each other. The world's most deadly game of "you go first." Is that guy with me or against me? Recognizing friend from foe became nearly impossible once the fighting started in earnest. While groups often wore identifying clothes or badges, these quickly became covered in mud, blood, and dust. In the panic of a shootout, men sometimes shot down their own allies by mistake. Records from the Lincoln County War show that as many as 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly forces, with hundreds or thousands of fighters swirling around the battlefield. Split-second decisions often had deadly consequences. Is this my blood? A terrifying moment came when you noticed you were covered in blood, but couldn't tell if it was yours, your enemies, or your friends. Blood splatter from nearby kills could cover you head to toe, making it impossible to know if you were wounded without taking time to check time you didn't have. When someone was trying to put a bullet in your head, many fighters described the surreal experience of being drenched in blood yet unharmed, while others didn't notice serious wounds until they felt lightheaded from blood loss. Do I shoot now or just keep ducking? Combat decisions became almost automatic as the shootout wore on. The conscious mind couldn't process information quickly enough to make thoughtful choices. Instead, fighters relied on muscle memory and instinct, training exercises drilled into frontiersmen over and over again would take over. Like a dance routine your body remembers even when your mind goes blank. Those who survived shootouts often reported having no memory of specific actions they took. Their bodies fought while their minds went elsewhere. It's like when you drive home and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip. Except instead of missing a turn, you might have shot 7 people. The human brain simply wasn't designed to handle the stress of Wild West combat. Fear, rage, and confusion took turns driving behavior with little room for strategic thinking. Modern studies of how the brain processes extreme stress show that higher cognitive functions shut down under threat, leaving only the most basic survival instincts active. For Wild West fighters, This meant that carefully planned tactics often gave way to primal responses within minutes. You'd start shooting at shapes rather than people. As exhaustion and stress mounted, vision could narrow to a tunnel. Instead of seeing whole people, fighters began to react only to movement and basic shapes. A flash of light, a blur of color, something coming from the left. Friend or foe became irrelevant in this state. If it moved toward you, you struck at it. Records from Wild West shootout survivors consistently mention this odd detachment, where other humans stopped looking like humans and became just threats or obstacles. After enough minutes of this sensory overload, the body would move on its own while thoughts became just white noise. Modern combat psychologists call this battle mind, a state where action precedes conscious thought. In this altered state, fighters reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, as if watching themselves fight from a distance. Time stretched or compressed, with some cowboys recalling minutes of combat that witnesses said lasted hours, or hours that passed in what felt like moments. This mental disorientation made a shootout even more chaotic than it already was. And when it became too much to bear, many chose the one option that actually made perfect sense. History books glorify last stands. Movies show heroic gunmen fighting to the death. The reality, most Wild West fighters had a more sensible approach. When things got bad, they ran. Battlefield records show that about 40% of Wild West groups would flee before combat reached its peak. This wasn't seen as shameful by ordinary folk. The shame came from notorious outlaws and lawmen with reputations to protect. Common folk followed the "I'd like to see my family again" principle. Wild West prospectors had a saying: the graveyard is full of heroes. The saloon is full of runners. Shootouts often ended because one side panicked first. Once a few people started running, it created a chain reaction. The gunfight at the OK Corral featured several moments where factions broke, ran, regrouped, and returned before the final outcome. Many fighters would play dead, fake injuries, or beg for mercy when cornered. Some hid behind horses or wagons. One cowboy survived by crawling inside a dead cow for hours. Not exactly the heroic tale you tell your grandchildren. Running away had its own dangers. Comrades might cut you down for deserting, and on the dusty plains, running any distance was exhausting. Many gunmen were caught simply because they ran out of breath. After 100 yards, those who did successfully escape often found that victory wasn't about glory. It was much simpler than that. When we think of victory in Western movies, we see cheering cowboys waving hats and heroic speeches. Wild West reality, far less Instagram-worthy. If you were still standing when the dust settled, congratulations, you won. That was pretty much the only victory criteria. No elaborate ceremony, no medals, just the profound relief of not being dead yet. It was basically the world's deadliest game of musical chairs. When the fighting stopped, whoever was still standing got the prize of continued existence. No dramatic cheering erupted when shootouts ended. Most survivors were too exhausted, injured, or traumatized to celebrate. Battlefields after fighting were eerily quiet places, with fighters simply sitting down where they stood, too drained to speak. The typical victory cheer wasn't hooray, but more like, thank God that's over. Does anyone have water? Then maybe a new pair of pants that don't have someone else's blood on them. The immediate aftermath focus on practical matters. You wiped blood off your face, hopefully not yours, and checked for wounds you hadn't noticed. You looked for your friends and collected usable weapons from the ground. Wild West post-shootout checklists were simple: arms still attached, legs still work, friends, some missing, enemies, more missing. Overall, a good day. The field became a grim marketplace after a shootout. Valuable boots were stripped from the dead, regardless of which side they fought for. Even belts were taken from corpses if they looked better than yours. Wild West recycling programs were way ahead of their time. Nothing went to waste, especially if it was shiny or still had a good edge. You celebrated by drinking whatever alcohol was available to dull both physical and mental pain. One frontier chronicler noted after a major shootout that the men drank for 3 days without pause, as if trying to drown what they had seen in cups of rock gut. Wild West victory parties were less "we are the champions" and more "please help me forget everything" through the magic of fermentation. Medical tents became crowded with the wounded. Frontier hospital waiting rooms had just the categories: might live and probably won't. Your category largely depended on whether the doctor had gotten enough sleep the night before. The physical aftermath lingered for days. Bruises appeared where you didn't remember being hit. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by sudden movements to block attacks that weren't there. Nothing says successful frontiersmen quite like punching the air in your sleep. and accidentally giving your spouse a black eye while fighting an enemy who died 3 years ago. And somewhere in the dust, a broken hat sat crooked on a rock. Wild West shootout sites were rarely clean. They simply grew over, with occasional bits of metal working their way to the surface centuries later. What movies called victory was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one fought not against enemies, but against pain, loss, and the knowledge of what humans could do to each other when ordered to.